What causes someone to commit a crime so shocking it leaves the world in disbelief? Today we're uncovering 5 real cases where justice confronted some of the most disturbing crimes you won't believe. From hidden rage to twisted motives, these stories expose the darkest sides of human nature, proving just how terrifying reality can be. You won't believe what these criminals did. So let's begin with our first case, Kirstie Flood. In Sandy Springs, Georgia, a mother named Cristian Fernandez had made a big choice. She asked her friend and babysitter, 29-year-old Kirstie Hannah Flood, to watch her 2-year-old daughter, Fallon. Kristen believed that Kirstie was dependable because they had been close for years. Kirstie had once helped Kristen overcome a personal struggle, so Kristen felt that she owed her a lot. When Fallon's daycare shut down, Kristen had turned to Kirstie for help, trusting that Fallon would be safe in her care. Kirstie had 2 children of her own and lived with her boyfriend, 28-year-old Jeffrey. Someone who knew her described her as kind at times, but others felt uneasy because of her past. She had previously been arrested on charges such as battery and drug possession, and despite all that, Kristen believed in giving her a second chance. Fallon was a sweet toddler who spent weekdays with Kirstie, and everything seemed fine until one night in December of 2020 when everything changed. On December 9th of 2020, an emergency call came to the Sandy Springs Police Department. Kirstie claimed that Fallon was unresponsive and may have fallen earlier. When officers arrived at Kirstie's apartment, they saw Fallon lying there, barely clinging to life. Paramedics rushed to Fallon's aid, but she was covered in bruises and had critical internal injuries and was fighting for her last breath. Kristen and Fallon's father, Cameron, rushed to the hospital. Sadly, Fallon would pass away from injuries within hours. Doctors noted that her injuries came from blunt force trauma and not from a simple fall. Fallon had a skull fracture, damage to her spleen, liver, and colon, and severe bruising all over her body. The findings would suggest a brutal attack. When detectives questioned Kirstie, her story kept changing. First, she and Fallon had fallen off a slide at a nearby park. Then she blamed the child's stepfather, a dog, or maybe even an accident around the home. She also tried to paint herself as a great babysitter who cooked healthy meals and always watched the children carefully, but nothing she said matched the horrifying injuries that were discovered on Fallon's body. During a later interrogation, Kirstie showed more concern about her phone being taken away than about Fallon and cried about her life being ruined, demanding her belongings. Police got a warrant to search her phone, and that's when they discovered internet searches like "I hit my child and feel guilty" and "What type of people enjoy abusing other people's children?" It was a huge breakthrough in the investigation. Neighbors would report hearing screams and a loud thump around the time that Fallon was injured. A friend who had gotten a call from Kirstie said she confessed to hitting Fallon because she wouldn't listen. After the child became unresponsive, Kirstie claimed she tried a cold bath and even to do CPR, but none of her efforts would match what the doctors saw at the hospital. Jeffrey was also in the home that evening. He later told police that he knew something was wrong, but didn't realize the child was in danger. As an adult in the house, he had a responsibility to protect the child, and investigators considered whether he had a role in the crime by failing to help or call for assistance sooner. After gathering enough evidence, including the autopsy, phone records, and witness statements, police would arrest both Kirstie and Jeffrey. Kirstie faced charges of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and cruelty to children, while Jeffrey was charged with murder in the second degree for not intervening or preventing the harm that led to Fallon's death. Kirstie's interrogation recording showed her changing her story, shifting the blame, and becoming defensive, and the court saw how she had tried to cover up her crime by telling officers and the child's mother different stories. Her phone records, along with the severe nature of Fallon's injuries, would seal her fate. At her trial, the jury heard the disturbing details of Fallon's suffering. Medical experts explained how a child doesn't end up with so many severe injuries from a minor fall, and witnesses recounted Kirstie's attempts to lie. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury would sentence her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jeffrey was sentenced to 15 years behind bars, reflecting his failures to protect a helpless toddler who depended on him as well. Kristen, overcome with grief, had shared how she never suspected Kirstie to be capable of such brutality. Fallon's father, Cameron, expressed rage and heartbreak, saying that he wished he had picked up Fallon sooner that day. The community was shaken that a babysitter could do something so cruel, especially someone who acted like a friend. Next up, the case of Uloma Curry-Walker. Cleveland, Ohio is a city known for strong neighborhoods and tight-knit communities. One such community was shaken when news broke of a firefighter named William Walker being murdered.
So this month, Cleveland firefighter Lieutenant William Walker was killed.
William was 45 years old, a dedicated professional who loved his work and had spent years saving others running into burning buildings while everyone else ran out. His kind heart extended beyond the fire station, and he was known to help his neighbors and friends in times of need. William had been through life's ups and downs, but things seemed to brighten when he met Uloma Curry. She appeared warm and supportive, and the two got married. However, she had serious financial issues. With large debts, she tried to hide them from William, and eventually she began to see a quick way out. If she could cash in on William's life insurance, her debts would vanish, and she could start fresh. What she didn't know was that William's life insurance still listed his ex-wife as the beneficiary. She never bothered to check before putting her plans into motion, and in her mind, William's policy was her golden ticket to wipe out everything that she owed. On November the 3rd of 2013, a quiet evening turned into chaos when neighbors heard gunshots outside of William Walker's home. Police arrived to find William lying in his driveway, shot multiple times. He would then be rushed to the hospital but died from his injuries. At first it appeared like a robbery, but the murder scene was odd. Nothing of value was taken and the violence seemed to be targeted. Uloma presented herself as a shocked and grieving widow, telling everyone she had no idea who would want William dead, but detectives noticed inconsistency. She acted strangely calm at times and her statements would change. During the investigation, they found something surprising. William's life insurance policy had his ex-wife's name on it, which meant that Uloma would gain nothing. The search led detectives to a string of people: Uloma's 17-year-old daughter, her daughter's boyfriend, and a young acquaintance who were all recruited to pull the trigger. Her daughter's boyfriend, Chad, would confess that Uloma had come to him pleading for help in hiring someone to kill William, and she promised money once the insurance had been paid. Chad then introduced his friend Chris, who agreed to be the hitman, and on the night of November 3rd, Chris would ambush William in his driveway and open fire. Text messages and phone records would reveal how carefully she had planned everything, manipulating her daughter by saying they needed the money and that William was somehow in the way. She tried to orchestrate the murder to look like a robbery gone wrong. But once the truth would emerge, each accomplice pointed a finger at Uloma as the mastermind. News of William's death would devastate his friends and co-workers. He was the fire station's hero, a man with a friendly smile who always had time for others, and as details of the murder-for-hire plot would come out, shock would turn into outrage. The idea that Uloma would drag her daughter into such a crime added another layer of horror. During the trial, the prosecution presented messages and testimonies showing how she had led every step of the plan. She never expressed any regret, and her face remained blank all throughout, even when hearing about the pain that William felt in his final moments. Chad and Chris would each describe how Uloma had demanded William's murder in return for the promise of money. The jury took only a few hours to reach their verdict: guilty of aggravated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and other related charges. At sentencing, the judge would call her actions heartless and beyond understanding, and she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Chad and Chris would receive long prison terms as well. William's family and fellow firefighters would speak out in court, remembering a caring man who was stolen from them far too soon, and they described how he had spent his final day at the firehouse, joking with co-workers and never suspecting that death was waiting on his doorstep. Uloma's daughter, who played a part in connecting Chad to her mother, would face consequences as well. She claimed that her mother had controlled her, and the entire community would be left asking how a person could destroy a life and a marriage for money, especially money she would never receive due to an outdated policy. Moving on, we'll discuss the tragic case of Sidney Powell. In the peaceful setting of Akron, Ohio, Sidney Powell seemed like an average college student. She had a caring mother named Brenda who worked as a child life specialist at the hospital and spent her days helping sick children cope with fear and pain. She was known for her gentle touch and warm smile. Yet behind Sidney's outward calm, she faced deep struggle. She found college life to be hard and her grades began to slip. Finally, she lost her place in school, and out of fear of disappointing her mother, it kept her away from telling the truth. Day after day, she would lie about her enrollment, hoping she could fix it all before Brenda discovered the problem. In March of 2020, the secret would come out. Brenda learned that Sydney had been dismissed from school. Worried and upset, she then confronted her daughter to talk about what had gone wrong and how to move forward. Instead of admitting the truth, Sydney grew panicked. With anxiety, shame, and anger mixed, a small argument would explode into a nightmare. Sydney grabbed a cast-iron skillet, striking her mother in the head. And as Brenda reeled in pain, Sydney stabbed her repeatedly. Only after the burst of violence did the woman realize what she had done. Emergency services would arrive at the gruesome scene. Brenda was rushed to the hospital but sadly lost her life. Friends and family would be left stunned. They had seen no signs that Sydney could do something so extreme, and investigators probed deeper, trying to figure out how a normal argument over college resulted in such a brutal attack. It soon became clear that Sydney's internal pressures had built to a breaking point, and she feared her mother's disappointment more than anything else. Sydney's legal team would argue that she had suffered from severe schizophrenia and a similar mental disorder that caused her to lose touch with reality that day. They claimed that she had a psychotic breakdown and did not understand the gravity of her actions, but the prosecution disagreed. They argued she knew right from wrong, pointing to how she had tried to cover up details immediately after the incident. The trial was tense. On one side, prosecutors would highlight the savage nature of the attack, reminding the jury that Brenda had been stabbed and beaten, indicating intense rage, while on the other, defense attorneys introduced mental health reports describing Sydney's history of emotional and psychological problems. After reviewing the evidence, the jury reached a verdict of guilty of murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. The judge, Kelly McLaughlin, would sentence Sydney to 15 years to life in prison. She cried as she heard her sentence, apologizing briefly, but to many it felt hollow.
Based upon the facts and circumstances of this case and in consideration of the relevant sentencing factors, including seriousness and recidivism, on count 1, ma'am, I sentence you to an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in the Ohio Department of Corrections.
Brenda's friends and family were left with an irreplaceable loss, and the hospital staff who worked with Brenda would mourn the death of a dedicated professional. People in the community would struggle to understand how a loving mother could end up being the victim of her own daughter's fear and anger. While some felt pity for Sydney's mental health issues, others believed she had choices that didn't involve violence. They pointed out that help was available and that stress, however strong it may be, could never excuse taking a life. Brenda Powell's legacy lives on in the children that she helped at the hospital. Co-workers remember her friendly approach, her willingness to listen, and her commitment to every patient. Sydney's story, however, stands as a grim reminder that hidden shames can lead to explosive outcomes. By avoiding honesty and help, a promising young woman had destroyed her future and the life of the mother who loved her deeply. Now we turn to the story of Cristian Fernandez. Jacksonville, Florida would see one of its youngest ever murder defendants in 2011. His name, Cristian Fernandez. Only 12 years old at the time, Cristian came from a troubled background. Born to a teenage mother, he never had the stable childhood that most kids would enjoy. His family moved often, he witnessed violence at home, and things were only becoming worse. A critical event took place in 2010 when his stepfather ended his own life in front of the boy, and the trauma deeply scarred him. Within a year, Cristian faced more upheaval. The family dynamic became tense, and he struggled to find positive guidance. Nobody knew that soon, heartbreak would strike again, but this time, Cristian was at the center. On March the 14th of 2011, Cristian was left home alone with his 2-year-old half-brother David. At some point, a terrible scene unfolded. David ended up with a severe head injury, a skull fracture that led to swelling of the brain. His mother didn't rush him to the hospital, but instead waited for hours, and by the time she finally arrived at the emergency room, David could not be saved. Doctors immediately suspected foul play. The injuries were too severe for a simple accident. Cristian had told investigators that he pushed David, or maybe threw him, and the exact details became muddy. It was clear that the 2-year-old had suffered a brutal impact, and Cristian, only a child himself, stood accused of a horrifying act. Local authorities would then make a stunning decision, charging Cristian with first-degree murder as an adult. It was an unprecedented event, and many believed that Cristian, who was only 12 years old, was still a child, someone who needed treatment and support rather than an adult trial. Others would argue that David's death demanded the highest possible charges. The case gained national attention, with news outlets across the country debating whether it was fair to hold a 12-year-old to adult legal standards.
The youngest person charged as an adult for first-degree murder in Jacksonville's history is set to be released. Cristian Fernandez was just 12 years old when he killed his 2-year-old half-brother.
Cristian's mother also faced neglect charges. She had waited too long to seek help for David, and some said she bore equal blame for the poor choices. Meanwhile, Cristian would sit in juvenile detention, lawyers arguing over whether he was mentally mature enough to understand his own actions. He had lived through abuse and trauma for years, and supporters claimed that the real failure was a system that never protected him in the first place, leaving him to become both a victim and a perpetrator. After long negotiations, Cristian agreed to a plea deal in 2013, pleading guilty to manslaughter, avoiding a trial that could have locked him away for life. Instead, he was sent to a juvenile facility until his 19th birthday. The plea would raise mixed feelings, some relieved that he avoided adult prison, while others felt that it wasn't enough for a child's death. David's family members, still grieving, wanted answers. They asked how a 12-year-old could do such a thing, and also blamed the mother for not keeping a closer watch. Cristian was a child with a history of violent outbursts and someone who needed therapy and constant supervision, but none of that took place. Cristian's release would come in 2018. At the age of 19, he stepped into a world that remembered him as the 12-year-old killer. The legal conditions of his release included counseling and strict guidelines that were meant to ensure he never harmed anyone else again. Some people worried that Cristian, shaped by a life of violence, was at risk of reoffending. His story leaves behind countless questions about how the justice system handles young offenders, especially those shaped by abuse and trauma. Did Cristian truly understand the finality of his actions? Could the entire tragedy have been avoided if the family or the system intervened sooner? David's death is the saddest part of it all. A toddler just starting life, hurt by the person who should have been a big brother. This case clearly showed that children living in unstable and violent settings can become violent themselves. And even now, people debate whether the system offered Cristian a second chance or simply set him up for more hardship. Finally, we examine the chilling case of James Holmes. James Holmes grew up in a comfortable home in San Diego, California. His father was a mathematician and his mother worked as a nurse, and money was never a big concern. James was bright, curious, and eager to learn and excelled in school. Graduating at the top of his high school class, he then headed to college, receiving honors and scholarships along the way. But underneath the success were signs of something dark. Holmes claimed to see nail ghosts as a child, which frightened him so much he once tried harming himself at the age of 11. As he grew older, the strange thoughts evolved into obsessions about violence and killing, and while some people noticed his jokes about murder, they chalked it up to stress or a weird sense of humor. Holmes would then go on to university to pursue a PhD in neuroscience, and it was there that his mental health deteriorated further. He wrote about wanting to kill people, fixating on grand and twisted plans, and saw a campus psychiatrist who worried about his behavior but never imagined the scale of what he had been planning. Late on the evening of July 19, 2012, he entered a Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, during a midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises. He bought a ticket like anyone else, sat for a while, and then slipped out through an exit door. Nobody thought much of it, but moments later he returned wearing tactical gear and armed with firearms, tear gas canisters, and smoke bombs. He then released the gas to confuse people and opened fire on the unsuspecting audience. People would scream and scramble under their seats, desperate to escape, and it turns out that Holmes had planned the timing, wanting to strike after midnight at the premiere so fewer children would be present. The scene was pure chaos as bullets tore through the theater, and in the end, 12 people died and 70 were injured, making it one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history.
He is largely a man of mystery, but it's also very clear over the last few months, as his life was in crisis, he began to make plans for his attack.
Holmes would then calmly walk outside and stand by his car waiting for the police to arrive. Officers found him, seemingly distant from the devastation he had just caused. He had booby-trapped his apartment with explosives, hoping to harm anyone who entered, but the bombs never went off, thanks to careful work by the bomb squads. Investigators soon learned how carefully he had prepared. He bought weapons and high-capacity magazines for weeks, and even sent a notebook full of his plans and violent fantasies to his campus psychiatrist on the day of the shooting. The entire actions seemed to be methodical, a step-by-step blueprint for terror. Holmes would immediately be arrested and face 24 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts for each person that was killed, along with 116 counts of attempted murder for those who survived. Authorities added charges for possessing explosives and inciting violence, and in court, Holmes often appeared distant, with dyed orange hair and a blank stare. His defense would argue that Holmes was legally insane, suffering from a serious mental disorder which left him unable to understand right from wrong. They brought in psychiatrists to testify about his delusions and violent fantasies. The prosecution pointed to the detailed planning, though, insisting that Holmes understood exactly what he was doing, showing that he was calculating and not clueless. For months, victims' families would sit through the trial, reliving the horrors of that evening. Survivors described gunshots, fear, and the pain of losing friends and loved ones, and many felt that Holmes deserved the death penalty, while others believed that his mental illness should mitigate his punishment. In July of 2015, a jury found Holmes guilty on all counts, but spared him from the death penalty, sentencing him to 12 consecutive life sentences, plus over 3,000 years without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was delivered, the judge's words were clear. The community could never risk Holmes being free. His sentence would ensure that he would die in prison. Some families felt closure knowing that he would remain locked away forever, while others wished for a death sentence, believing that no mental condition excused the slaughter of innocent people. Holmes's lawyers asked the court to consider his psychiatric problems, but jurors concluded that his careful preparation, the booby traps, and the timing of the attack showed awareness and intent. After the verdict, many survivors and families spoke about the emotional scars they would carry forever, remembering the victims, the 12 lives taken in a place that was meant for fun and escape. Holmes now sits in prison under extremely tight security and far from the public eye. The Aurora community still honors those who were killed and is trying to heal. Memorials, candlelight vigils, and annual events remind everyone of that tragic night. The theater reopened but was remodeled, reflecting the city's efforts to move forward while remembering the past. These 5 shocking crimes left entire communities in disbelief, from babysitters turned murderers to hidden rage exploding overnight. They show how quickly that life can go dark. Did these stories shock you? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments section down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life crime stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.